Hello everyone, this is Author D.L. Tillery here, also known as the Mistress of Horror. Today's episode is going to be all about the categories of horror. So we're going to go over those, but first before we jump in, how about you press that subscribe button and give this video a like so you know when I upload new videos. Make sure you ring that bell. Alright, so let's jump into the categories of horror. As I talked about in my last episode, that this episode would be all about the categories of horror, and I have come across the fact that there are none that are official exactly. There are people who have made their own list of categories and what those entail, so you can take it with a grain of salt, I'm saying here. This list is my compilation of what I think and how I think of the categories of horror. And this can flow either direction, whether that is for novels and or movies and or video games even. Anything that is made with horror can follow these categories. I follow these categories for my horror, and there is one in here that's not a popular opinion, I'm sure. Maybe there's more than that. I don't know. I don't really care. Alrighty, so getting right into this, let's go right down the list. Now I have 10 categories in my setting, and I have my notes here. So the first number one is monster. Now monster horror is think about the movies and or books such as Tremors, Frankenstein, Godzilla are good ones, and of course like the Creature of the Black Lagoon. Those would be monsters. And if you don't know of those, you can simply look them up, Google them. They're in book and in movie form. Maybe some of them are. I think all of those are actually novels, if I'm not mistaken. Tremors possibly is not a novel. I saw it as a movie, obviously movie series, but it may actually be a novel because in most cases, movies are based off of novels. Alright, so that being said, monster, some people's category monster will include things like vampires and werewolves, things of that nature. I do not include those in the monster category because they are not really monsters. They're not really monsters. So they'll come up in my category, so I'll let you know which one those are for me. Number 2 is gore / splatter, whichever one you want to call that, since splatter is just an intense level of gore and violence with a lot of blood. So that's explaining splatter gore. Good ones for that far as writers would be Edward Lee. He has some really good splatter horror, splatter punk horror, that's a genre too, with a little splice in there. And a movie adaptation with that I really like is Hatchet. That one's very gory. It has, what do they call him, one of the masters of horror? I'm not sure, I guess, because maybe he is. I know he's in a lot of horrors. His first name is Kane. He plays the monster, air quote, in this one. And we'll touch on that about how horror does do intertwining on itself, meaning all its different categories can be mixed in. So that happens a lot. I will go over that near the end of this video. Number three is psychological horror. Now, I really like psychological horror, and then some people don't like psychological horror, obviously, because every category is different. And psychological would be an example of Psycho, which is a novel and a movie, and Bird Box, which is a novel and a movie. They're both done in different ways. Now, Psycho is obviously a psycho. He's a murderer, you know. And then in Bird Box, it's more psychological, even more so, meaning a lot going on in the psychological aspects of things. And then some of it had some truth to it, it seemed. There's different aspects of psychological horror. It could actually be happening and still be psychological, or it could not really be happening and be psychological in the mindset that you're imagining what's happening, which makes it psychological. To you, the viewer, it may not be, or the reader, it may not be, or it may not seem as if it's psychological at the time, and then at the end you find out this is psychological, this is not really happening, like they're imagining it, or something happened to make them have a psychological like episode. So yeah. Number 4, paranormal. Now as we know, in the writing world and in the movie industry, paranormal seems to have a lot of things in it. And I think it needs to stop. Like, I think they need to stop. Because you hear paranormal, first person's thought process for paranormal in general, not talking about just the writing world, because in the writing world we know, like, when we hear paranormal, it's probably going to have supernatural under it. But the same thing applies to film in most cases, and I think it needs to stop. It needs to stop. Supernatural can have its own category. I really don't know why they felt the need to just umbrella all these different things. They're nothing alike together. It makes no sense to me. Like, I don't get it. I don't get it. Anyway, an example of paranormal would be something like ghost stories, for instance, which may be in all what I saw in movie form. Stuff like, maybe House on Haunted Hill, something like that. Something that is ghost based or in the paranormal activity. You know, they count paranormal. When you look up the definition of paranormal, it would be like telekinetic, phenomenal based things for paranormal. But that does not mean supernatural. So I don't really know where they started throwing the stuff under that umbrella. Some people put, like, I saw one guy's chart, and he had a paranormal, I believe, and he put something like demons and hell and something else under there. I'm like, no. So, yeah, everyone has their opinions, obviously, and horror they're not exactly being policed with it, so technically you can say whatever you would like to say. But to me, it doesn't seem to fit when you can simply put those things under supernatural. But whatever. I digress. Not really. So that's, in my opinion, that's what that goes. And then number five is supernatural. And supernatural would be, that's where I'm going to put vampires and werewolves and things along those lines. There's a lot of that horror, rather in book form and or film form. Also in video games as well. We'll get into that later. Then I would give an example of things like two vampire novels I've read, of course, those series I should say. One is a one-shot, one's called Blood to Blood. That one's a really good vampire story, which is, of course, supernatural, but I think has a romance undertone. But a lot of vampire stuff does have romance undertones. We'll talk about that in another video. And then, obviously, everyone knows who Lestat is. Anne Rice is a really good writer for vampire stories. She's, like, really known for that. So things along those natures. So think about werewolves and vampires and I guess you can't say angelic stuff. That's more like mythology or something like that. But you could put it on the supernatural when you talk about writing and or film. But definitely wouldn't go towards paranormal with that. That just they need to stop doing that. Like, they need to stop doing that. But anyway, moving on to number 6. Number 6 is one of my favorite, cosmic horror. So, cosmic horror, also known as, they'll just throw Cthulhian horror on it for those who don't know about cosmic horror. Cosmic horror, you can think of things of like Call of Cthulhu and It. Yes, It by Stephen King is pretty much cosmic horror. And the creature in the story is pretty much cosmic being. He doesn't really have a sex. Is a cosmic being. So, yeah. Look up cosmic horror. So if you don't understand what that is, I can give you a few examples as I just did. Definitely check out H.P. Lovecraft's stories, because H.P. Lovecraft was very much into cosmic horror when he wrote. And Stephen King has done some cosmic horror aspects. I think It may be the only one, but I'll have to look into that. But a lot of Stephen King's stuff is connected. So It has traveled through different stories of his, actually, and been around. It's even a thing said that in It, that It is actually from The Stand as well. If you've seen that or read that book of Stephen King's, Randall Flagg, that's in that as the antagonist in there, the villain, is actually it. So that's a whole lot of things. If you I think someone did a retrospective on it. I'll have to check into that. But I heard someone talk about it before, where they did like a timeline of like how Stephen King stuff is connected together, and it being the creature that goes through a lot of his stories. So, which I think is cool. I love it when the writers do that. And cosmic horror is so good because it's really doesn't things don't get explained exactly. Like, you don't get a lot of explanations with cosmic horror about the beings, because they are cosmic beings. They're the way they think isn't like the other things we have in horror, being vampires and werewolves and other small type of creatures and things of that nature. So cosmic beings are really unexplainable. You know when it's a cosmic being involved because of the effect that they have on the location that they're in, as far as the world. It starts deteriorating in a way of like darkness, and it's very interesting, to say the least. Very, very interesting. All right, so number 7 is romance horror. Now, I like romance horror. I write some romance horror and will be publishing some of it in the future, happy to say. Romance horror will be things like Warm Bodies and one called Dark House. Yes, Dark House. That I think both are novels. I know Dark House is a novel. Warm Bodies, I didn't read the novel, but I believe it is a novel before it became a movie, or vice versa, whichever. But both of those are good examples of romance horror, meaning it has the horror aspects with romance in it as a subgenre, I would imagine. But again, that's another one of the movies or stories that I think definitely do that intertwine thing that horror does with itself. Takes its genres and really mixes them together, but sometimes they just fall under one banner of one type of horror genre, even though it has multiples in it. And I'll go over those examples of that later. All right, and moving on to Undead Horror. Yes, Undead Horror. I decided that there should be a category counted as for Undead Horror because there are so many zombie movies out there, being them being the lead in Undead. There are other Undead type creatures that someone can categorize that, but zombie being the lead one in that. And yeah, they kind of have to have their own category because there's so many of those. And then they have zombie movies that are subgenre, like Warm Bodies, for instance. Definitely a Undead horror with romance horror subplot. So, but I wouldn't say, I guess in Warm Bodies it wouldn't be a subplot because it kind of was focal on that, but then the zombies are the big part of the thing. So you got that intertwined thing going on with the romance horror with Undead. So, that being said, those are two examples of that. Night of the Living Dead would be, I mean, Undead stuff. There's plenty of zombie movies. 28 Days Later. So many. I mean, I've been watching them since I was a kid. And those can also intertwine gore, because, of course, Undead Horror, there's splatter and gore in it, because a lot of times. But then you got ones that's not as gory, but people like the gore and splatter in Undead Horror, for sure. Alright, moving on to number 9 is comedy horror. Comedy horror. Now, as we know, there are a lot of, what do you call them, B horror movies. Like, they're bad horror movies. It's called B horror movies. But we can enjoy those as well. Horror is one of those genres where it can be cheesy or bad, air quote, and it's really enjoyable horror movie and or book. A good example of that would be like Shaun of the Dead, for instance. That's one of my favorite ones, horror comedy, because it actually is an undead horror with a comedy aspect. So that one's done very well. It's very funny. You could look up just comedy horror in novels and or film and then find something to check out if you're interested in mixing those two genres together. Very, very interesting and good, and sometimes to take a lay off that. All right, moving on to number 10, our final category is thriller horror. My least favorite, that's why it's probably number 10. My least favorite in horror, because I don't go after it to watch. I do watch it. I've seen most of the ones that are thriller horrors, meaning, in my opinion, usually people-based horror, meaning serial killers, stuff like Hostel would be an example, Last House on the Left, and Wrong Turn, for instance. Wrong Turn is just people who are mutated. They don't exactly explain how they got mutated, or maybe they did one of them in so many of the Wrong Turn movies, like a lot, and they get worse as they go. Like the first one's probably the best one. But it's still thrill. Like they're still people. Like the guy's kids are like mutated or whatever for whatever reason. You know how they do that. And then they're like super strong instead of like being the opposite. Like they're mutated to the point that like their flesh is like completely deformed and on itself and stuff like that. So of course they make them all like country bumpkins and stuff, and then they go like, oh, inbreeding air quote stuff. Like okay, stop the nonsense. But anyway, so they do stuff like that, and then they're like, these are killer, you're scared. Like, no, I'm not scared. I mean, when I'm comparing thriller, like, I don't hate thriller. I'm kind of like, because usually those fall under thriller, though thriller does have some sub things where it draws in, and it's not that necessarily like people type of killers and stuff like that. Like Hostel is like pretty much people, and they're like, oh my god, these people were in a hostel, air quotes, a hostel. And they stay there, and then like these people were murdering and everything like that. I was like, okay, I have a better chance of survival against a person who's a human being that has a knife or a gun or whatever types of things they're using to kill me. I have a chance of survival because I can try to fight them. And with a monster or supernatural, paranormal even, I probably don't have much as a chance unless I have something going on with me that are along those lines. You know what I'm saying? So that's why I'm like, not very that scary. You know what I'm saying? So that's like my least favorite. Some people are really into that. They really like it. That's cool, whatever. But not for me. I have watched them all. I do enjoy them for what they are, but I'm not going to look at a thriller horror and think I'm going to get like scared. Like I watched Saw, which Saw would be more along the lines of it's kind of like thriller with gore splatter. Because again, it is a person in controlling this, and it's like traps and stuff like that. But it's splatter and gore because obviously there's lots of blood in people's body parts and stuff like that. But again, that's involving, I think it has also to me like a little psychological in it as well, because of the reasons why the guy's doing it to people. So throw that in there while you're at it. That's that thing I was talking about with horror. It does it a lot. I'm telling you. So that being said, those are the 10 categories of horror that I have materialized here. Those are the ones. So again, I'll go through them real quick. You have monster, you have gore and splatter, you have psychological and paranormal, you have supernatural and cosmic horror, you have a romance horror, undead horror, comedy horror, thriller horror. 10 categories. Alright, so one thing I want to touch on before we're out of here is the oddballs. Now, the example of an oddball horror would be It Follows, for instance. Had a very specific message that it was giving off. This would be a mixture, in my opinion, of psychological and thriller. And it kind of was psychological thriller and paranormal, maybe. The way they represented the creature, being, or entity in this movie was internally spread between people who would have intercourse. So it was kind of touching on people randomly having sex with people or not thinking about that process. That is something that to really be thought about when you have sex with people. This is what the message they're putting out. And that you can sexually transmitted diseases was a focal point, but it was like if a sexually transmitted disease was a entity that killed you in a way. So it's psychological and thriller because it's not a monster or a supernatural being or technically a person that's killing you in this. It's kind of like it's and people are passing it around and everything. But yeah. So that being said, yeah, I would think that It Follows is an oddball because it's a mixture. It's that mixture thing, that intertwining thing that horror does. So it's an oddball because of how the entity in it is represented, and it is represented in a sexually transmitted disease type of way. Like, it pretty much was an entity that was transferred from one person to the other. Think about how The Ring was done. Now, The Ring and The Grudge are some of my favorite horror. The Japanese versions, not really the American adaptations, because they did change some stuff. So those would be under, I think, supernatural. It could be supernatural, like a supernatural paranormal. Whew, supernatural paranormal mixture, in my opinion. I don't really think I want to say monster in there. Maybe psychological. I mean, it's not really psychological, so I would say it's a supernatural paranormal mixture for those. That's my two. That's my two favorite genres besides cosmic horror. So those are my top three. So my top three horror genres that I really love is cosmic horror, supernatural, and paranormal. And then the other ones fall in line after that. I do really like all different types of horror because I'm the Mistress of Horror, so obviously I do. um, but I will give you also an example of the intertwined thing that they do. Evil, let's see, splatter comedy horror. Evil Dead being a splatter comedy horror. So Evil Dead is like, it's not really that funny because some of that stuff gets really like creepy and serious, but it definitely is splatter, and it can be partially put under comedy because sometimes it's not taking itself serious when it's doing it. And then that's what I meant by horror genres mixing in on themselves, intertwining, like that amongst its own categories, which is really cool that they do that. So yeah, I really love horror. I watch horror year round. Some people can't take horror; they're like creeped out by it, but I love it. So I guess I couldn't be the Mistress of Horror if I did not love it. I'm just saying. All right, so thank you guys for watching. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Mistress of Horror on the 10 horror categories that I enjoy and have categorized. Next week's episode, I'm going to be talking about a video game aspect of horror, one that is cosmic horror based, and it is called Eternal Darkness. So I'm going to talk a bit about that one and let you in on that. So if you are actually into video games, then you could join me for that episode. If you're not, maybe you still should join me, so then you can find a little bit about how cosmic horror works, because I think Eternal Darkness does it very, very well. Very well. Alrighty, I'll see you in the next episode. Stay scared.